Hello and welcome to Business on the Wire with me, Mitali Mukherjee. COVID has left in its wake a stream of inequality, perhaps more heightened than any time before. Unfortunately, while this is a global phenomenon, India seems to have come out with much deeper and sharper cuts than many other countries. Let's just look at the data for a little bit. For those looking at the India numbers, according to World Bank data, India's share of the world's extreme poor is higher than its share of the world's population. Just to explain that a little bit, India now accounts for 139 of the total 690 million odd people living in extreme poverty. That's over 20% in terms of India's contribution. Compared to that, our population stands at under 18% of the world population. Again, more data from the World Inequality Report of 22 that's been released by the Paris-based World Inequality Lab 2020. The income share of the bottom half of the Indian population was estimated to have fallen to only 13%, that's 13%, while the top 10% of India's population captured 57% of the national income. And then within that, the top 1% alone got 22%. Some have scoffed this data, saying it's not accurate, saying that the world and many global institutes have a skewed version of what India looks like. So let's look at what the local data suggests, what the local data collectors have found, and what this is all pointing to. This is important because in the context of this kind of backdrop, it's also crucial to ask what the government can do and what the government is doing at this point to address that inequality. Joining me to talk about all of that and what the data is suggesting and to deconstruct it more importantly is Ashwini Deshpande. She's founding director at the Center for Economic Data and Analysis, or CEDA, at Ashoka University. Ashwini, thank you for joining in. I want to start off with an event that just went by because it had people on two very different ends of where we landed. What did you make of the union budget, and did it check the boxes that it needed to?
Hi, Mitali. Thanks for having me on your show again. It's a pleasure to talk to you. On the budget, honestly, I was disappointed because I think we need to remember the context for this particular budget, which is 2 years of severe COVID-induced distress, which has been a health crisis, but it's also been an economic crisis. And one would have expected the budget to address both of these aspects very squarely. Now, of course, the people who are who are cheering the budget are basically focusing on the capital expenditure. And they're saying it's pro-growth, it's pro-expenditure because of the increase in capital expenditure. So on that, I want to say that as a absolute amount, it's just about 2.1% or 2.6% of the GDP. So first of all, it's not a massive amount, proportion of the GDP. That's the capital expenditure. Secondly, the order of magnitude of the increase this year is the same as last year. So we should have had some introspection about whether the increase in capital expenditure last year produced the desirable effects that people are claiming this year's increase will produce, right? So that's the capital expenditures side. The third thing I want to highlight is that everybody's labeling the capital expenditure as if it's going to directly translate into an increase in employment, it's going to generate jobs, and it's going to alleviate economic distress, right? So there are many ifs and buts in this chain of thought. So first of all, we have to remember that not all the capital expenditure is for infrastructure. First. Second, to the extent that it is on infrastructure, so about 25% of it is on infrastructure, not all infrastructure projects are labor intensive. So the number of jobs that the new infrastructure projects will create is open to speculation at the moment. Most of all, 75% of the capital expenditure is not for infrastructure. For example, last year, capital expenditure, by the way, consists of actual expenditure as well as repayment of loans. So last year, for example, to pay back the Air India outstanding loan, the amount that was spent, it was about 51,971 crores. was put under capital expenditure. So when you see an outlay under capital expenditure, not all of it is actual expenditure, right? So I think that these are all the issues that we must be aware of when we consider whether the capital expenditure proposed this year is going to automatically translate into livelihoods, into increasing livelihoods. And I don't think it is going to. Some of it will, of course, but not all of it. So I think the scale of government expenditure that was needed in the context of the acute economic distress, where people have lost jobs, where small enterprises have shut down, where payroll support, MSMEs are struggling with payroll support, etc. The migrants crisis, just the sheer number of deaths during COVID means that people have lost earning members, children have lost parents, right? And so when you think of all of these factors, we needed a budget that allocated very clearly earmarked amounts to increasing expenditure for health, for employment generation, for reviving the small scale industries, and for rural and urban relief. And I think on all of these counts, the budget has been a disappointment.
Ashwini, you raised a point in the part of your answer where you said on capex, we don't know what happened last year. This seems to be also one of the recurring problems, that there is no report card on what is happening. For example, on the NIP, I asked a couple of government officials where things stand, whether this spend was part of NIP or separate from it, and the answers were yes, it's separate. No, it's ongoing. So there is no report card in terms of where are we at, what do we need to do, what is our shortfall. That's one that I wanted your thoughts on. And the other, the response to some of the concerns that you raised was by shrugging it off by saying that of course we'll do it, if this spend is required later in the year, we'll do it. But does it not betray the budget itself? Does it not betray largely a mota, as they say in Hindi, statement of intent? This is how we intend to move. This is not where we intend to spend a lot. And that's really the path that we have chosen.
No, absolutely, you're right. I mean, if the government officials are saying we'll do it when it's needed, aapke muh mein ghee shakkar, please do it. But the budget, and so budget is only one of the many documents and one of the many statements of policy that the government puts out. But the reason that it's become such an important document is because it signals intent. So when I had written a piece in the HT before the budget, and I basically said that it's not as though everything hangs on the one statement that the budget is. But the budget goes a long way in conveying to the people of India that these are the priorities of the central government. And I think that's where one would have expected a greater attention in the budget on what I believe are the priorities. In fact, some of the words the finance minister never even uttered them. The word migrant, I mean, I think that she didn't utter them. I might be wrong, but I'm just saying that either they were not uttered at all or they were very low frequency terms. So, the poor, migrants, COVID deaths, distress, livelihoods, I didn't hear these words as much as I thought I would hear them, given what the experience of India has been. Now, typically the response to this is, well, all countries in the world have suffered from COVID. Economic slowdown has been a characteristic of all economies. Of course it has been. But I think there's data to show that the Indian economy contracted by a greater percentage compared to other economies, one. Two, in terms of the relief package, again, I think the Indian government's relief package is not as large as the relief packages that have been given in some of the other countries. The United States, for example, has done both a fiscal spend as well as supply side measures. And in India, somehow, supply and demand side measures are seen as, we can either, as contrast. So we can either go one way or the other. I don't see why not both.
Yeah.
When the crisis is so acute and so big.
Yes, absolutely. And I want to take a couple of steps back from the budget itself, Ashwini, to, the state of affairs as they stand. The biggest problem, as most economists have flagged, is this large income inequality that you referred to as well. Part of it is an outcome of COVID, but part of it has just been opening up like a gaping hole over the last couple of years. I mean, what does the data show us, for example, for the last 5 years on how income inequality has moved across India?
No, thank you for raising this point, because, the income inequality, the first immediate manifestation of the income inequality is also in the kind of recovery that we are seeing, post the worst first lockdown. So this is what, is famously called the K-shaped recovery, where if you look at the incomes of two segments of the population, you see that the growth that the economy has seen has basically on the backs of the top 10%, maximum of the Indian population. So when you plot the share of incomes, it literally looks like a K, where the share of the bottom 50% is declining and the share of the top 10% is increasing. That's inequality. But even when you look at the sectors in which this growth has sort of resurfaced, it's been though that growth has been fueled by the recovery in the incomes of the top 10%. Right now, one of the issues about inequality data in India is that we don't have very good income data. And, when you look at household surveys, there is an issue of just people incorrectly reporting their income, not necessarily out of malice, but just because in agricultural societies, it's very hard to separate income net of expenditures, etc. It's hard to make that calculation. So it's not that people are just outright lying, but it's just harder in developing countries. And the rich don't answer surveys. So, the top end of the income distribution is never captured in household surveys, not in India, nowhere else as well. But in other countries, there's income tax data. Income tax data tells you how the top 1, 5, 10% are doing. In India, again, income tax data is not available as freely. And secondly, there's large amounts of tax evasion by the very rich. So for all of these reasons, I think whatever estimates about income inequality we get are underestimates of the actual extent of inequality, because we don't have a very good estimate of the top end. But even with all of these caveats, I just wanted to make that clear. Even with all of these caveats, if you looked at the latest Oxfam report of the India supplement of the Oxfam report, it tells us that the number of Indian billionaires increased from 102 in 2020 to 142 in 2021. Remember, this is the year in which the majority of Indians saw a steep fall in their incomes and in their livelihoods. There's a Forbes billionaire report for October 2021, which reports that more than 80% of India's 100 richest families increased their wealth over 2020. In particular, 2 families saw their net worth multiply in 1 year by 8 times for Gautam Adani and twice doubled for Mukesh Ambani. So the rich grew richer in India, and the number of poor increased. So we don't know whether the poor grew poorer. That's again, that's an issue of the income data. But definitely the number of poor increased, and India had actually made substantial progress on reducing the headcount ratio of poverty in the immediate post-liberalization years. And that substantial progress stands threatened to be derailed because of COVID. And this is where I feel not just the budget, but overall thrust of economic policy has to be to arrest the increase in poverty. Yeah. Even if you said, I don't care about inequality, but the fact is it's happening. And inequality is not just a matter of, you want to push everybody into poverty. You want Indians not to grow rich. No, high inequality threatens growth. So even if you did not care about, equality for its own sake, for egalitarianism, you should care about inequality, because it will threaten growth, which India very badly needs. Yeah. So even to lift everybody up, you need growth. And for that, inequality has to be lower.
Yeah. And one more stat from Oxfam, Ashwini, the fact that the wealth of these billionaires, their fortunes is, it's grown 10 times over a decade, and it's now larger than the union budget. Just to, give people a sense of the enormity of wealth we're talking about. You raise a really important point, because there seems to be this, the building of this debate about a growth-based narrative versus an inequality-based narrative. But even on growth, if you look at what's happened, Ashwini, in the last 5 years, and admittedly there's been COVID, the fact that for 5 years in a row, our country has seen growth slipping. I think Dr. Kaushik Basu pointed out the last time we saw that was in 1947. Is it a misnomer to believe that growth will keep happening even if inequality exists and widens?
It cannot. No country in the world has seen that. Inequality eventually starts to put brakes on growth. Why is that? Because the incomes of the richest growing and the incomes of the poorest falling, or the greater proportion of the population becoming lower middle class to poor, means that the size of the domestic market starts to eventually shrink, because the rich, the proportion of the incomes that they consume actually is lower compared to the proportion of incomes that the poorer population consumes. And the size of the domestic market cannot just grow on the backs of luxury goods. So if you want a mass market to grow, you have to ensure a middle class, a steady increase in the Indian middle class, as well as more and more people out of poverty, people who have the purchasing power to buy, right? So just by the economic logic, of the market size, a growth in inequality is not good news. For an increase in inequality is not good news for the growth of the market. The second very big consequence of an increase in inequality is a rise in social tensions. People get upset when inequality, when they see that their livelihoods are being threatened, whereas somebody else's, a few people at the top getting richer, and that need not necessarily result in a sort of an economic protest, riots for food, etc. It can go into very dangerous directions. Having unemployed people, having people who've lost their livelihoods, particularly youth who are unemployed, they are going to get into very dangerous activities on a multiple level. And we've seen that in South Africa. We've seen that in many countries in South America, where high levels of inequality have created massive unrest. That has not all resulted in a sort of progressive questioning of the path of economic policies. That has often gone in many different directions. Yeah. And so high inequality is inimical to growth. I think there are no two ways about it.
As I think we've seen in some parts, some of the recent episodes of online harassment, it's surprising to find that the perpetrators are between the 18 to 23 age range. They are well educated. Some of them, or many of them, are from technical institutes. So some of those dots, I think, are beginning to fall in place. What surprises one, Ashwini, is that when you try to have a conversation with those who are either advising the government or are in charge of making these decisions, it is almost like this doesn't exist. So I want to ask very categorically, is there any data that suggests this is not the case, that we do not have a situation of widening inequality and hence acute stress on families in the lower income, even the middle income range at this point?
I would love to see that data, honestly, and thank you for asking this question, because one of the areas of concern, that I'm the director of CEDA, Center for Economic Data and Analysis, and one of the, we are 1 year old now, by the way. And so what CEDA has been trying to do is to make as much of data that exists anywhere available to the public and write simple data narratives. So for example, we've written about youth unemployment using EPFO data, one of our data narratives. One of the areas of concern for me, has been the absence of data. So you take something like COVID deaths, right? You would need to know how many people died over the last 2 years. What is the excess mortality that was caused by COVID, in order to forget about the health thing, just even to understand the economic consequences of COVID, because people lost, families lost earning members. Where is the data there? And you see a gap between the data that independent journalists or researchers have been putting together versus the official data. Incomes, consumption level. The last consumption expenditure survey, you know when it was done? It was done in 2011 and 12. We are in 2022. I want to see, all of us want to see how Indian people's consumption has changed. And the NSS consumption expenditure survey is one of the richest surveys of the kind in the world, actually. It's held as an example of how in very difficult conditions, under a country like India, which is poorer in terms of infrastructure compared to some of the developed countries, manages to pull off the consumption expenditure survey, but we haven't seen it in over a decade now, And so where I would be the happiest person if somebody showed me actual data that showed inequality has not risen as much or has actually even declined, if that's possible. But where is the data? So why doesn't the government release the consumption expenditure survey? And why don't we have it every 5 years as we used to earlier? We do badly need that.
Just as we need unemployment data, which we do not have.
Exactly.
Which is CMI monthly, and even the World Bank data, which frankly, Ashwini, is shocking if you look at it in terms of where we stack up. I mean, youth unemployment that you were talking about, India is just ahead of places like Yemen and Turkey at 23%. What have you observed on the data about youth unemployment? And, how does one respond to this argument where people say, unemployment to hamesha tha. It's always been a problem. We have a large population, we have unemployment.
Nahi, itna nahi tha. So that's, I think, first things first.
Yeah.
Unemployment. So, one of the things about developing countries is that it's true that developing countries in general have a lower rates of open unemployment because there is a lot of underemployment, right? So people, you see that on the streets, for example, in Delhi, people are just hanging around, or there's a construction site, there'll be a few workers working, others are just hanging around giving instructions. So they are not gainfully employed. Now, in developed countries where the economy is completely monetized, so either you're working or you're completely unemployed, or you're working full-time or part-time or completely unemployed. But in developing countries, the situation, so you could be sort of partly or employed or engaged in survivalist activities that give the illusion of being employed, but they basically allow you to get by, right? And so open unemployment in developing countries tends to be lower than open unemployment in developed countries. But conditional on that, given all that, if you see the number or the proportion of the population, especially the youth, that say that they're openly unemployed, which means they are willing to work, they are looking for work, but are not finding work. That's open unemployment, right? It's not about underemployment. That number has risen. I would say that it's at highest since 1947. And this is not just the CMI data. Just very recently, Mr. Mohanan, who used to be the chairman of the NSS, has written a piece for us analyzing the periodic labor force data from NSS. And he's talked about, for the last year, 2020 to 2021, and has documented the number of people that fell out of employment, that lost jobs because of COVID. So whether you believe the CMI data or you believe the NSS data, because these are the only two sources of data that we have. CMI is real time, whereas NSS comes to us after a lag. But Mr. Mohanan has actually analyzed the loss of employment as well as the loss of income using the PLFS of NSS. So if you don't believe CMI, look at the NSS, right? We don't know when the census data will be released, but that will also show us something. And so the jobs crisis is absolutely real. The CMI data, for example, shows that the overall open unemployment increased from 6.52% between January and December 2021, from 6.52% to 8% between January and December 2021 in 1 year. Okay, and urban unemployment in December 2021 was at 9.3%. That's 1 in every 10th person in the working age group that who's looking for work. We also find from our analysis on the CEDA data portal that the number of people who are actively looking for work is also declining. And this is because of that's just the labor force participation rate. So you don't even declare yourself as unemployed. You just say, I'm not looking, because this is called the discouraged worker effect, which is when you think that there isn't work available, you stop looking. So for the first time in India, I think overall LFPR, labor force participation rate, according to CMI data, has come down, which doesn't mean that nobody in the family works, but the number of people in the family that are actively looking for work goes down, because you feel like, okay, if there's one job, let so and so look for it. So a decline in LFPR, nobody can claim that the decline in LFPR is a sign of Indian prosperity, that Indians don't feel the need to work because they're so rich now that they don't want. I mean, that possibly can't be true, right? Yeah. So when you see a decline in LFPR, it shows that unemployment is a key. Second thing I want to point out, Mithali, is we have this campaign called Make in India, and the expectation from the Make in India campaign was that manufacturing jobs will double. Now, CEDA did an analysis of sector-wise trends in manufacturing, and we find that between 2016 and 2021, manufacturing sector that accounts only for 17% of India's economy, so it's not a very large sector in that sense. Yeah. In 2016, 51 million Indians were working in the manufacturing sector. In 2021, it was 27.3 million. So the absolute number of people employed in manufacturing declined by 46% in 5 years. Forget about doubling. It didn't even stay constant. So agriculture is turning out to be the sector of last resort, which is absorbing people, because agriculture is the only sector in which you haven't seen a decline in employment. We are supposed to be an emerging economy, which means, and there's supposed to be structural transformation, which means you're supposed to go from agriculture, manufacturing to services. Yeah. And what do we see? Of course, COVID has, exacerbated this situation. But even pre-COVID, go back to 2016 to 2021, absolute number of people employed in manufacturing declined. That's a massive feature that we need to be aware of. So, I mean, I would like to know, I don't meet too many people working in government, but, maybe you should ask somebody, has there been some introspection? Where did the Make in India thing go wrong? Is protectionism in today's day and age the right policy to follow? When India immediately became independent, there was the import substitution strategy followed. At that time, it was a newly independent emerging country. Maybe some protection was needed. But today in 2021, 22, do we need to be protectionist? Is that the best way to grow? So these are questions that we need to ask.
So, this is a great segue for my question, because this is what was lobbed back at me, Ashwini, when I talked about unemployment, saying it's only an urban problem. It's not a rural problem, one. And secondly, even if we do have to address an urban problem and, for example, think of an urban jobs program, just like NREGA exists, how do we do it? Like, what are the dynamics of it? How do we pick out who is counted and who is not, because of the nature of migrant labor, as you know? These were the many question marks that were thrown at my question. So let me, because I have the benefit of you over here, lob it back at you. Is unemployment only an urban problem, or are we seeing different strains of it in rural India as well? And secondly, is it that difficult to construct an urban jobs program if you so choose to do it, or if you see that there is an acute need for it?
No, so urban unemployment is higher than rural, that's for sure. Yeah. But it's not absent in rural also, So even if you have 6 to 7% unemployment in rural areas, where declaring oneself to be openly unemployed is, was not what used to happen earlier in rural India. You would a small proportion of people would say, I'm openly unemployed. People get by, through agriculture, etc. So agriculture has provided a cushion. Now, to the people that you meet, just ask them this following question. There was a target to generate 100 million jobs in manufacturing by 2022.
Yeah.
Okay. In 2021, we are at 27.3 million. So what happened? That's one. The second thing is, when you think of NREGA or urban employment guarantee, or any safety net program, we have to remember that these are safety net workfare or welfare programs. This is when people don't manage to get decent work through the regular functioning of the economy, then schemes like NREGA or any similar scheme would come to their rescue. NREGA is not to be confused with a robust economy providing jobs through its normal functioning, which are decent, well-paying, full-time jobs. And NREGA maximum provides 100 days employment, at minimum wage, which is a good safety net. And of course, it must be continued and it must be strengthened, and money is to be poured into it and all of that. But remember always that it's a safety net. And somehow when we talk of employment creation, the discussion gets stuck on the safety net component of it, which is very important, of course. But when do we need safety nets? When we are not unable to find livelihoods through regular means. Supposing you had a robust manufacturing sector that was generating jobs through factories and offices and so on and so forth, why would you work in NREGA or its urban counterpart?
Yeah.
Right. So it's only when people who are unable to secure work, or there's acute distress, say something happens, then you have the NREGA to fall back upon. But something that you fall back upon possibly cannot be your sort of mainstay going forward. So that's one. When it comes to urban employment guarantee, yes, I agree, it's challenging. The nuts and bolts, etc., will have to be discussed. But I will say, why not focus on generating jobs in urban areas? So, for example, take the MSME sector.
Yeah.
Right. There is this credit-linked the CSLG, the credit-linked scheme, etc. Very good. It was taken up last year by MSMEs, and to waive off loans or to offer credit, etc., etc. That's good. Nothing wrong with that. The idea is basically we are giving you loans, you produce. But think of a small factory owner, when that factory owner himself or herself has lost people, they're not sure because factories have been shut, they've gone back to their villages, or they don't know when they can come back. Secondly, the person is not sure whether there's going to be demand for the product or for the service that he or she they're producing. Why will they take a loan? Or to what extent do you think a credit-based program will induce small manufacturers to say, okay, fine, they're just going to take a loan and take a risk and produce? What if there's another lockdown? What happens to the workers? Do they come back from their villages? The workers also don't know. Where will they stay? Are they going to get paid if there is a lockdown for a month or 2 months? What if there's a fourth wave, right? So that's why several of us have been saying right from the beginning that the fiscal boost must consist of payroll support to MSME employers, because they are tiny, small employers. They don't have the financial bandwidth to pay their workers when their factories are shut. But if there was payroll support, they could pay them. And then these workers don't lose their jobs, right? And so there's a floor. Then they don't need an employment guarantee kind of a program because they are getting paid, on a regular basis. So what I'm trying to say, Mitali, is that while we must absolutely think of urban safety nets, not without question, but that conversation cannot be a substitute for a business as usual, by which I mean decent jobs available to the workforce commensurate with their education levels and with their aspirations. If I have done a master's degree, I want a job that's commensurate with my skills. If I'm an engineer, I want a job that's commensurate with my skills. I mean, I'll settle for an NREG kind of a job if my family is on the streets, but that's not why I studied, right? And so education levels of Indians, both men and women, have expanded rapidly, which is fantastic. But then we need an economy that absorbs all that talent. We talk about youth dividend, this dividend. Where is, what's that youth dividend doing?
Yeah.
Where are they getting absorbed?
I'm intrigued by this data about from the 2016 to 21 period, Ashwini. I mean, what possible reason would there be for an almost 50% drop in jobs? Did the private sector start sacking people en masse? Because the markers that I can spot are demonetization, GST, and at this point COVID. And the second part of that is the services sector. I mean, admittedly, okay, over the last 2 years there's been trauma and stress, so there's been an increase in job losses. What was happening with the services sector, through that period as well, because they are the ones who really generate jobs.
So I think both these, so it's unfortunate that this particular 5-year period has been marked by three catastrophic events: demonetization, GST regime change, and COVID. And for example, the services sector was hit bad by the GST regime change, because now this year, from the finance minister's announcement, it seems like the GST revenues have been buoyant. But the first few years of the GST regime were very difficult, particularly for the smaller service providers, because the compliance regulations, the exemptions, GST was supposed to make life simple. Instead, it just I'm not a tax expert, so I'm not going to go into too many details because I don't know them. From what I hear, compliance with GST regulation was a nightmare, particularly for smaller service providers. Demonetization, we have to remember that the Indian economy, more than 80% of workers work in the informal sector. And informalization of the Indian economy is not because people are hiding cash under their mattresses and people just want to evade taxes. So non-compliance with tax is only a small part or a small segment of the informal economy. A large part of the informal economy is just because the nature of activities is survivalist, is very small scale, very low productivity employment, which deals a lot with cash. So when demonetization hit, it hit the informal economy really hard. Really, really hard. And so there is, now all kinds of estimates coming out about the decline in GDP, the decline in jobs, etc. So I think that this particular 5-year period, which has seen this decline, has really been unfortunate in terms of just these three shocks. But at least two of those shocks were government decisions. They were not, caused by nature.
Yeah. I have one final question, Ashwini, which is I know I'm asking you to sort of look into the future. At this point, with the data that we have, the World Bank seems to indicate that growth for us over the 2020 to 23 period is about under 3%, which is shorter than even what countries like Bangladesh are pointing to at this point, which is closer to 5%. What does that make the nature of the next few years coming up for us look like?
Challenging. I mean, growth is only one indicator. Now, if you look at just the size of India's economy, it shrunk by, there are different estimates, but over COVID, it shrunk by about, I think it was supposed to be 145. What are the units now? 145 lakh crores or whatever it was. It was 145 and it shrunk by 15 to 20 lakh crores. So the absolute size of the cake has shrunk. So when I was on one of the shows immediately after the budget, and when I talked about inequality, somebody said to me, one of my fellow panelists said to me, "Oh, you guys, you are always worried about the slice of the cake. You're always about, oh, how is this cake going to be divided between different people? And you always get worried when the slices are unequal. You never care about the size of the cake." Well, actually, we do care about the size of the cake. And I think what's a real wake-up call, should be a wake-up call for all of us, is that the size of the cake has shrunk. So when we think of growth post-COVID, remember it's on a smaller base. So what that means in terms of its ability to create livelihoods is therefore a little more complicated than if the size of the cake had not shrunk. Yeah. Right? So when do we get back to the pre-pandemic size is one, and then when do we grow from there? And, women are about 50% of our population, of most countries' population. India cannot grow to its fullest potential. The size of the cake will not increase when majority of the women are not able to, those who want to work, are not employed in gainful employment. So female labor force participation is seen as, something else. We'll worry about that later on when when all other things are fixed. Well, I would like to mention here that it's integral, to any plan. It should be integral to any plan of economic revival or recovery that India foresees. When women are not able to find gainful employment, the Indian growth story will remain thwarted. The one thing that Bangladesh has done really well on has been to increase female labor force participation rates, right? And that has various multiplier effects. So for example, son preference, there's evidence to show that son preference in Bangladesh has started to weaken its stranglehold. In India, that can only happen if women are gainfully employed, right? And so Indian GDP will never grow to its fullest potential if women are not employed. So you haven't asked me this question, but I want to answer this anyway, which is that, people say, oh, but, Indian women, there are these regressive social norms that, women are dropping out of the workforce. Well, I've been questioning that narrative for a while now, not that there aren't regressive forces on the rise. And I think all of us need to be concerned about that. But having said that, what the data shows is that proportion of women who are in gainful employment has not declined. It's the number of hours that women work that has declined. And that, because of the because of the way in which work gets calculated, that shows up as a reduction in the labor force participation rate. There's been a recent paper that's looked at time use survey from 1998, and the latest one, 2019, comes to the same conclusion. So we have to be very concerned and aware of the fact that as long as women's productive potential is not utilized to the fullest, Indian growth and the growth in Indian GDP would always remain thwarted. So even if we didn't care about gender equality or equality or any of these things for any other reason, just for growth purposes, I think we need to pay attention to gender equality in the workforce and women's economic potential. The fact that women's economic potential is not getting fullest expression as it should, because women's educational indicators have vastly improved over the last decade. Their aspirations have improved. They want to work. So first we have to let them study, wearing whatever they want to wear. And secondly, we have to create an economy that allows women of different skill levels, different aspirations, different desires for themselves to work. They cannot be sexually harassed on the way to work, inside the workplace. They have to be able to get transportation to go to the workplace. Streets have to be, and their families and communities have to create a conducive environment. But I think this is essential if India were to get back, if India wishes to be a Vishwa Guru and growth leader and a leader of the world, actually.
Yeah. And you have to think about them more than the 4 months into elections and voting. There's a broader...
and also it's not just a matter of Ministry of Women and Child Welfare. Women's economic participation, it cuts across all ministries, all government departments, and all programs.
Yeah.
So it has to be a gender approach, has to be integral to all economic plans, both for the corporate sector, and I'm not just saying it's a problem of the government.
Yeah.
So whether it's the private sector or the government sector, all sectors of the economy have to pay special attention, have to mainstream gender equality. It has to be second nature.
Yeah, no, I hear you, and I'm glad we took that turn in our conversation, because I deeply admire the deep work that you have done around gender, and I cannot agree enough. And this is not about one part of our economic population either. This is a problem right down from the top to the bottom. Thank you so much, Ashwini. As always, a very happy birthday to CEDA. I hope you guys keep up the great work with, analyzing and interpreting data. And it's always such a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Mitali. It's been great. And thank you for inviting me to your show. It's great chatting with you.
Get a sneak peek of exclusive content before everyone else for channel members only. Memberships start at ₹89. Hit the join button below.